Hello everyone and welcome to another video. A few weeks ago I managed to beat the Rio Carnival scenario with just a no entry sign, and in the process I ran it completely into the ground financially. During the 1500 years it took to complete, the park acquired a debt of more than 17 million euros. On the video I made about it, I got a lot of comments asking if it would be possible to somehow save this park and turn the red numbers black again. I thought that was quite an interesting idea, so that's what we're going to attempt to do today. This was the situation where we left off. A terrible, ruined park with more than 14,000 guests stuck walking in circles forever. Let's begin the rejuvenation by removing the no entry sign and finally freeing the guests. It must feel really good for the guests to finally be able to go home. I just hope that they can afford all the therapy they need to process this nightmare. Now we're left with a park that has a few broken down rides, a bunch of stalls, 3 handymen, 11 entertainers and the inability to spend any money directly, but we can still pay for things like staff wages. Speaking of staff wages, those 11 entertainers cost us 605 euros a month, which is a complete waste of money. We don't need our guests to be happy, all we need is to get their money and then they can F off again. To get those guests we will need to fix the broken ride, so I decided to hire 3 mechanics. The reason I hired 3 of them and not just 1 is that after some experiments I found out that 3 seemed to give the best balance between keeping the rides running and keeping the expenses low. We did actually start out with 2 mechanics, but in the previous video they both drowned after inspecting or fixing one of the boat hires due to a bug. To prevent that from happening again, I simply sold both rides. This does reduce the number of guests that we can attract to the park, but it also means I can just let the park run without constantly needing to check if the mechanics are still alive. Assuming that none of the remaining rides are broken down, they can attract a total of 285 guests. The way we extract money from these guests is by charging for the park entrance. Since the rides are extremely old, we can only charge 10 bucks for the entire park, but that is still enough to make some money. After the guests have paid for their entry, we don't need them anymore, so we're going to make a few changes to make sure that they leave as quickly as possible. Firstly, I removed the tile of the queue line that connects to the ride entrances, making sure that the guests cannot actually ride the rides. In addition to this, I removed all the food and drink stalls so that getting unhappy from being hungry and thirsty is another reason for them to get out of my swamp. This has the added benefit that we don't need our handyman anymore. If the guests are unable to ride the ride, they cannot get nauseous enough to puke, and if they can't buy food or drinks, they cannot drop any litter either. This allows me to ruin 3 more lives by making the handyman unemployed, while they're probably unfit to work ever again after being trapped in the park for 1500 years. Now that we've fired most of our staff and fixed the rides that have been broken down and abandoned for hundreds of years and are totally safe now, we need to do one more thing before we start our financial revival journey, and that is $20 umbrellas. When it rains, guests will pay anything for an umbrella, so with this we'll make some extra money from umbrellas every few months. And with this final action we can finally start fast forwarding and begin our journey. A few years into the run we can take a look into our finances and determine whether this is enough to make more money than we spend every month. We only have 2 different expenses, which are ride running costs and the staff wages. The rides cost 220.2 euros to run every month, and the 3 mechanics are slightly more expensive at 240 euros. This is a total of 460 euros and 20 cents of money spent every month. The income mostly comes from the park entrance and the occasional umbrella splurge when it rains, but we also make a little bit extra from selling maps pointing the guests to the rides that they cannot access. From the entrance we usually make between 400 and 1400 euros a month, averaging about 700, which is already enough to offset the expenses. The umbrellas make us about 150 a month on average, and the maps provide another roughly 30 bucks every month. This gives us an average profit of a not so high 420 euros a month. In the previous video we lost about 3 times as much per month for 1519 years straight, so this is going to take a while. Luckily we only have a few hundred guests in the park at a time, so we can speed up to times 128 instead of only times 8, meaning it won't take another 400 real life hours this time. 100 years into the recovery run we haven't even made €500,000, confirming that this will indeed be one hell of a marathon. 18 years later, a real celebrity walks into the park, guest number 100,000. He hasn't done or achieved anything special, but because he just so happened to be the 100,000th guest, he gets a little bit of recognition before he too leaves the park, never to be seen again. 259 years after we began, we have made our first 1 million euros. We're still in massive debt, but we are making progress in the right direction. The strangest thing here is that a theme park can do exactly the same thing for a quarter of a millennium and still make profit. Over the next 1000 years nothing particularly interesting happens, so let's fast forward to the year 2955, where we reach our next big milestone, the 1 millionth guest. Once again, a random guest who was born in the right place at the right time got famous for doing nothing, while other guests who achieved much more got absolutely squat. In the year 3628, more than 2100 years after we started, we have finally managed to reduce our debt from 8 figures to just 7 figures. We're not quite halfway yet, but with nearly 8 million euros paid back, we're well on our way. A nice 469 years later, at the start of year 4097, something interesting happens. The financial overview window completely breaks. It stops showing any numbers at all, even though the park is still running like usual. This glitch happens because somewhere in the code of the financial window the number that stores the year only goes up to 4096 instead of the 8192 that the rest of the game uses. This was fixed after I first noticed it, so if you have the latest development version of OpenRCT2 the financial window will not break. Another 2000 years later, our debt has been reduced to less than 1 million, and if you look at the guest list you can see something interesting. Even though most of the guests have a number larger than 3 million, there are a few with a much lower number still in the park. 2 of them even have a number under 14,600, meaning they were part of the original guests that helped us beat the park in the previous video. How on earth are they still in the park after all this time? Well, they're both stuck simultaneously queuing for a ride and being on that ride. To reduce the number of sprites necessary for the game, guests can only ride most rides in pairs of 2. If a guest is queuing on their own, they will walk through the entrance building, but they will only actually go on the ride if another guest shows up in time. If no guest shows up, they will walk back out of the ride again. When they are in this position, they will never leave the queue, except for when the ride is closed down or sold. Both of these guests were the only one queuing when the rides broke down for the final time, after the last mechanic had drowned. Ever since then, the rides have either been broken down or inaccessible, so no one else will ever join them for a ride. These guests are stuck in eternal loops of attempting to go on the ride and then being disappointed when nobody shows up. The other 7 guests are all lost in the exact same place, right behind this building. For some reason they cannot find the park exit from this exact position and are eternally stuck there. They are extremely unlucky, as out of more than 3 million guests they are the only 7 ones that got stuck at this weird party behind a 6,000-year-old theme park hotel. In the year 6388, which is almost 5000 years after we started making money again, we finally managed to break out of our debt and see the negative numbers turn positive again. This took an astonishingly long time. It took longer than the time span between the construction of the Great Pyramids and today, and in that time more than 1 million useless park maps have been sold. This is by far the longest challenge I have ever done, and I can't wait to see what kind of ridiculous challenge will take even longer than this in the future. If you want to see another long challenge, you can watch this video where I beat extreme heights with only Flaming Fury. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.